In the summer of 530 AD, a 25-year-old general with 0 major victories faced 50,000 of Persia's finest warriors with just 25,000 exhausted Romans. The Eastern Roman Empire was hemorrhaging territory, bankrupt, and everyone knew the Persians were unstoppable. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The Persian army lay shattered, and the youngest general in Roman history had rewritten the rules of warfare itself. Think about those numbers for a second. 25,000 against 50,000. A 2-to-1 disadvantage facing an empire that had crushed Rome for 2 centuries. The fate of Constantinople, of Christian civilization in the East, hung on the tactical genius of a kid barely old enough to grow a beard. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Belisarius turned mathematics itself into a weapon. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the trench system that shouldn't have worked but became medieval warfare's blueprint for 800 years. Second, why the elite Persian immortals charged directly into a killing ground they could see coming. And third, the cavalry maneuver so unexpected that Persian commanders thought they were hallucinating. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did a general with no battlefield experience outsmart commanders who'd been winning wars since before he was born? What tactical innovation did Belisarius hide in plain sight that every Persian scout missed? Why did this single battle save an empire that was already writing its own obituary? How did trenches, simple ditches in the dirt, become the deadliest trap in ancient military history? To understand how a 25-year-old nobody destroyed Persia's reputation for invincibility, we need to step back to when Rome itself was dying, and everyone knew it. Constantinople in 529 AD was an empire writing its own eulogy. The treasury was empty, the army was a shadow of its former glory, and the Sassanid Persian Empire had been systematically dismantling Roman power for a generation. Emperor Justinian sat on a throne that commanded respect in name only. Beyond the walls of the capital, Persian armies moved with the confidence of wolves among sheep. The eastern provinces were bleeding tribute and territory, and every military mind in the Mediterranean knew the truth that nobody dared speak aloud. Rome's time was over, and Persia's century had arrived. The numbers told a story of systematic collapse. In the past 20 years alone, Rome had lost 17 major fortresses along the eastern frontier. The annual tribute to Persia had climbed from 11,000 pounds of gold to 17,000. Wealth that Constantinople could barely scrape together without stripping churches of their ornaments and melting down imperial plate. The Roman field army, which had once numbered over 200,000 professional soldiers, had been reduced to fewer than 90,000, scattered across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. Most devastating of all, the eastern Limitani, the border guards who were supposed to be Rome's first line of defense, had been so thoroughly beaten that entire garrisons now surrendered without fighting when Persian banners appeared on the horizon. Think about what that meant. Roman soldiers, the descendants of the legions that had conquered the known world, were throwing down their weapons at the mere sight of Persian cavalry. The psychological dominance was complete. Persian King Kavad I didn't even bother with formal declarations of war anymore. He simply sent letters demanding gold, and Constantinople paid. When Roman ambassadors traveled to Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, they were made to prostrate themselves on the ground before being granted an audience. The humiliation was calculated, systematic, designed to break Roman will before breaking Roman armies. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The real catastrophe wasn't military. It was economic. Every pound of gold sent to Persia was a pound not spent on walls, weapons, or wages. Roman generals couldn't recruit because they couldn't pay. They couldn't train because they couldn't afford equipment. They couldn't even maintain the roads that moved armies quickly between threatened sectors. The famous Roman logistics machine, the system that had sustained legions across 3 continents, was grinding to a halt for lack of funding. Fortresses fell not from assault, but from simple abandonment. Garrisons pulled back because there was no money to feed them, and empty walls were worse than no walls at all. But here's where it gets genuinely worse. Justinian knew all this. He understood that his empire was hemorrhaging to death, that every tribute payment was another step toward total Persian domination. Yet he had no choice but to keep paying, because the alternative, open war against an enemy that outnumbered, outfought, and outmaneuvered Roman forces at every turn, meant accelerating the collapse he was desperately trying to delay. The emperor was trapped in a death spiral, watching his empire circle the drain, and everyone from the Senate to the streets knew that Constantinople's days as a great power were numbered in years, not decades. And then, in the spring of 529, Justinian did something that looked like either desperate genius or complete insanity. He appointed a 25-year-old general with 0 major victories to command the eastern frontier. His name was Belisarius, and nobody, not even Justinian himself, could have predicted that this obscure officer was about to save the empire that everyone had already written off as dead. Belisarius was 25 years old, and his resume was terrifyingly thin. No major victories, no legendary tactics, just a minor skirmish command and a reputation for being Justinian's favorite, which in the cutthroat world of Byzantine politics meant he was probably more politician than warrior. The veteran commanders whispered behind his back. The soldiers eyed him with barely concealed skepticism, and the Persians didn't even know his name. When Justinian appointed him to command the eastern frontier, it looked like the desperate gamble of an emperor with no better options. What nobody understood yet was that Belisarius had spent his entire youth studying every military disaster Rome had suffered, cataloging every mistake, and building a tactical system in his mind that would turn conventional warfare on its head. The appointment shocked everyone who mattered. General Cetus, who had commanded eastern forces for 12 years, was passed over. General Buzes, veteran of 6 Persian campaigns, was ignored. Instead, Justinian chose a staff officer whose only claim to fame was commanding 300 cavalry in a border skirmish near Minduos, a minor engagement where he'd driven off Persian raiders more through luck than skill. The Senate was bewildered. The military establishment was furious. Letters circulated among the officer corps predicting disaster, and several senior commanders openly requested transfers rather than serve under this inexperienced boy general. Think about the pressure. Belisarius arrived at Dara in April of 530, knowing that every officer under his command expected him to fail, wanted him to fail. So they could tell Justinian _quote _0_ and return to their comfortable postings. He had perhaps 6 weeks before the Persian army would march. 6 weeks to turn 25,000 skeptical soldiers into a fighting force that could face twice their numbers. His second in command, a hardened veteran named Hermogenes, made it clear in their first meeting that he considered this appointment a death sentence for everyone involved. Here's what the veterans couldn't see. While they'd been winning minor engagements and collecting their pay, Belisarius had been conducting a different kind of warfare, an intellectual campaign against military orthodoxy itself. He had studied the disaster at Callinicum, where Roman cavalry had charged Persian horse archers and been slaughtered. He had analyzed the catastrophe at Amida, where Roman infantry had tried to hold walls against Persian siege engines and failed. He had pored over accounts of the Battle of Singara, where Rome's numerical advantage had meant nothing against Persian tactical flexibility. Every defeat, every retreat, every humiliation of the past 30 years, he had dissected them all, looking for patterns, for the fundamental mistakes that kept repeating. What he discovered was that Rome kept losing the same way. Roman generals fought predictably, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. Charge and hope your armor holds. The Persians had spent 2 centuries learning to dismantle this formation. Their horse archers would kite Roman cavalry, drawing them into killing grounds. Their heavy cavalry would wait for the Roman infantry to tire, then smash through at the decisive moment. It was mathematical, systematic, and Rome kept walking into it like sleepwalkers heading for a cliff. But Belisarius had seen something else in those old battle reports, something that gave him an idea so radical that even thinking it bordered on military heresy. What if the battlefield itself could be weaponized? What if terrain wasn't just the stage for combat, but an active participant? What if you could build a battlefield that turned enemy strengths into fatal weaknesses? The Romans had fortifications, walls, siegecraft. But nobody had thought to apply siege engineering principles to open field battles. Nobody except Belisarius. When he arrived at Dara and began surveying the terrain with his engineering officers, the veteran commanders thought he was wasting time. Battles were fought with soldiers and steel, not shovels and geometry. They were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon in warfare isn't courage or numbers. It's innovation that your enemy doesn't see coming. And the Persians, marching toward Dara with 50,000 warriors and centuries of victory behind them, had absolutely no idea they were about to become the test case for a tactical revolution. The fortress city of Dara sat like a knife at Persia's throat, 90 miles from the Persian border, uncomfortably close to Nisibis, the jewel of Persian military power in the west. For decades, this had been the killing ground where empires measured their strength. And for decades, Rome had been losing. The Persians would raid, Rome would pay tribute, and the cycle would continue until Constantinople ran out of gold or cities to sacrifice. But in 529, something changed. A new Persian king, Kavad I, decided tribute wasn't enough anymore. He wanted Dara itself, and he was willing to commit an army that would dwarf anything Rome could field. The message was clear. The time for negotiation had ended, and the map of the world was about to be redrawn in blood. Dara had been built just 30 years earlier, in 505, specifically to counter Persian dominance of Nisibis. Emperor Anastasius had poured 3 million gold solidi into its construction, enough wealth to field 10 legions for a decade. The walls rose 40 feet high, built from limestone blocks that weighed 2 tons each. 12 towers jutted from those walls like teeth, each one capable of holding 50 archers. The fortress could shelter 10,000 soldiers and twice that many civilians. It was engineering on a scale that screamed defiance at Persian power. But here's what made Dara truly valuable. It controlled the only major road between Persia and Roman Mesopotamia. Take Dara, and Persian armies could pour into Roman territory unopposed. Hold Dara, and you forced every Persian invasion to take the long way around, adding weeks to their campaigns and bleeding their logistics dry. The Persians had tried to take it 4 times. In 507, they'd besieged it for 3 months before winter forced them to withdraw. In 513, they'd bribed the garrison commander. He took the gold, then killed the Persian envoy and displayed his head on the walls. In 518, Persian siege engines had breached the outer wall, only for Roman counterattacks to butcher the assault forces in the rubble. Each time, Dara held. Each time, Persia's reputation took another wound. Think about what that meant to Persian prestige. This wasn't just a military target. It was a psychological humiliation visible from their own border. Here's where it gets worse. Kavad hadn't just decided to take Dara. He declared it in writing, sending a letter to Justinian in March of 530 that read more like a funeral announcement than a declaration of war. Quote 1. The arrogance was calculated, designed to force Justinian into a response that would look weak either way. Abandon Dara and admit Persian supremacy. Defend it and watch another Roman army get destroyed. Either option accelerated Rome's slide into vassal status. But there was a third element that made this crisis truly existential. Persian scouts had been mapping Roman defenses for 2 years. They knew exact garrison strengths. They knew which commanders were competent and which were political appointees. They knew that Rome had pulled troops from the eastern frontier to deal with riots in Constantinople and rebellions in the Balkans. The intelligence advantage was crushing. Persia would arrive knowing everything, while Rome would be fighting blind against an enemy that had studied every weakness. When Persian advance scouts were spotted just 15 miles from Nisibis in mid-June, carrying banners that indicated a force larger than anything assembled in a generation, the garrison at Dara sent desperate messages to Constantinople. The emperor's response arrived by fast courier on June 23rd. Quote, _2_. The implication was clear. Reinforcements weren't coming, retreat wasn't permitted, and every man in that fortress was now playing for stakes that transcended their individual survival. What those men didn't know yet was that their young, untested general had already decided this wouldn't be a siege. He was going to make the Persians come to him in the open. On ground he chose, where their numerical advantage would become their greatest liability. The Persian army that assembled near Nisibis in early 530 was a monument to imperial power. 50,000 warriors, perhaps more, drawn from every corner of the Sassanid Empire. The core was the legendary immortals, 10,000 elite cavalry whose name alone made Roman soldiers check their wills. These weren't conscripts or farmer soldiers. They were professional killers bred for war, equipped with the finest composite bows in the world, protected by scale armor that could turn aside Roman swords, and commanded by generals who had been winning battles when Belisarius was still learning to walk. Among them rode the Savaran heavy cavalry, mounted on horses that cost more than a Roman soldier earned in a lifetime. Armored so heavily, they looked like mobile fortresses. The Persian host moved with the confidence of an empire that had forgotten what defeat felt like. The numbers defied belief. 10,000 immortals formed the core, elite cavalry who had earned their name because their ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000, with replacements so seamlessly integrated that the unit appeared eternal, unbreakable. Each immortal carried a composite bow that could punch through mail at 300 yards, a spatha sword forged from crucible steel that held an edge Roman smiths couldn't match, and wore lamellar armor, hundreds of small iron plates laced together, that distributed impact so effectively it could turn aside direct sword strikes. Their horses were Nisaean stallions, bred for 16 generations specifically for warfare, standing 16 hands high when Roman cavalry mounts averaged 14. Think about that. Every single advantage, from genetics to metallurgy to training, favored the Persians. Behind the immortals rode 20,000 Savaran heavy cavalry, the shock troops that had shattered Roman formations from Amida to Callinicum. These warriors trained from age 5, spending 12 years learning to shoot from horseback, fight with lance and sword, and coordinate charges with mathematical precision. Their armor weighed 70 pounds, but their horses were bred to carry it. They fought in units of 1,000 called drafts, each commanded by an officer who had won his position through combat prowess, not political connections. The Romans had nothing comparable, no equivalent training system, no breeding programs, no metallurgy that could match Persian steel quality. Here's what made this force truly terrifying. The Persian army commander was Persius, a general who had won 17 major engagements against Roman forces. 17 victories without a single defeat. He had broken the Roman defense at Theodosiopolis in 502, crushed the relief force at Amida in 503, and personally commanded the cavalry charge that routed Roman forces at Callinicum in 531, though that battle hadn't happened yet. Persius already had the tactical reputation that made Roman commanders avoid direct engagement. His second in command, Barismanes, had served in the Persian military for 32 years and commanded cavalry forces that had operated from the Hindu Kush to the Mediterranean. These weren't ambitious nobles playing at war. They were career warriors who understood logistics, psychology, and the systematic application of violence better than anyone alive. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Persians didn't just outnumber the Romans 2-1. They out-equipped them, out-trained them, and brought tactical doctrines that had been refined through 2 centuries of warfare against Roman forces. They had intelligence reports detailing exactly which units Belisarius commanded, down to individual officer names. They knew Roman tactics because they'd been defeating them for decades. They even knew the terrain around Dara better than most of the Roman garrison. Persian scouts had been mapping the region for 3 years. When Persius surveyed his 50,000 warriors assembled in their perfect formations, saw the sun glinting off scales of armor that stretched to the horizon, he made a decision that would echo through history. This wouldn't be a siege. Sieges were expensive, time-consuming, and gave the defender too much agency. Instead, he would draw the Romans out, destroy them in open battle with overwhelming force, and march into Dara over their corpses. It was the logical decision, the correct tactical choice based on every precedent, every battle report, every lesson learned from 2 centuries of Roman-Persian warfare. What Persius didn't know was that he was about to face a general who had thrown out every lesson, questioned every precedent, and built a tactical system specifically designed to make conventional superiority meaningless. Dara sat in a shallow valley with a small stream, little more than a creek, running in front of the city walls. To the north, gentle slopes led to the Persian positions. To the south, the city itself formed an impenetrable backstop. Standard military doctrine said you never fought with your back to a city. It turned retreat into a massacre. But Belisarius wasn't interested in standard doctrine. He studied that shallow stream, that open ground, those gentle slopes, and saw something nobody else did. A canvas for the most innovative battlefield engineering since the Roman legion was invented. While Persian scouts watched from distant ridges, Roman soldiers began digging. Not fortifications, exactly. Not quite trenches either. Something new, something the Persians had never encountered. The veteran officers thought their general had lost his mind. They were wrong. On June 26th, 530, Belisarius assembled his engineering corps, 200 men who normally built siege engines and repaired walls, and gave them specifications that made them question his sanity. 3 parallel trenches, each exactly 5 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running perpendicular to the stream in a staggered pattern. The outer 2 trenches would angle forward at 30-degree angles, creating a V shape that pointed toward enemy positions. The measurements were precise to the inch, marked out with surveying stakes and rope lines as if he were building a temple rather than battlefield defenses. The engineers looked at the plans and saw amateur hour, trenches that wouldn't stop infantry, couldn't stop cavalry, and seemed designed more for drainage than defense. General Hermogenes confronted Belisarius directly on the second day of digging. These trenches are too shallow to be barriers, too narrow to hold troops in formation, and the angles make no tactical sense. Cavalry will simply ride around them. Belisarius's response was chilling in its confidence. Quote 4. Hermogenes walked away, convinced he was serving under a madman. But the digging continued. Here's what the veterans couldn't see. Belisarius had calculated something that no Roman general had ever considered: the mathematics of compression. That shallow valley was 200 yards wide at its narrowest point. 50,000 Persian cavalry couldn't deploy in that space. They'd have to attack in waves, and those waves would naturally spread out, looking for room to maneuver. The trenches, positioned exactly where cavalry would instinctively move to flank, would force them into predetermined killing zones. Not by blocking them, by making certain paths seem easier than others. The trenches were psychological traps disguised as tactical errors. Think about the genius of this. Traditional fortifications announced themselves. Walls said quote, _5, . But Belisarius's trenches whispered, "You can cross here easily." They invited attack through specific corridors while appearing to be nothing more than amateur obstacles that cavalry could navigate. Persian commanders would see them, dismiss them as the work of an inexperienced general, and ride directly into the trap without realizing they were being herded like cattle into a slaughterhouse. By June 28th, 25,000 Roman soldiers had created 1,500 yards of interconnected trenches. The center trench was deeper, 7 feet, and reinforced with wooden stakes. This was where Belisarius planned to hide his reserve cavalry, completely concealed from Persian scouts who were mapping Roman positions from distant ridges. From elevation, the trench looked empty. From ground level, it could hide 600 mounted warriors who would appear as if conjured from earth itself. Here's where it gets insane. Belisarius positioned his infantry in the gaps between trenches. 4,000 men in each gap, arranged in compact formations that could wheel and adapt based on where the Persians committed. The trenches protected their flanks while leaving them mobile enough to shift positions. Traditional defensive lines were static, rigid, vulnerable to being fixed and flanked. Belisarius's system was fluid, responsive, a battlefield that could fight back. When Persian scouts reported the Roman dispositions to Perazes on June 29th, they described exactly what they saw: an inexperienced general who had wasted 3 days digging useless ditches and positioned his outnumbered army with their backs to a city wall. Perazes smiled. This would be even easier than he'd imagined. What he didn't understand was that he was looking at the future of warfare, and he was about to become its first victim. Dawn on the first day of July, 530 AD, broke hot and clear over Dara. 50,000 Persian warriors formed battle lines that stretched across the horizon, a sea of armor and horseflesh that seemed to have no end. War drums thundered in rhythms designed to terrorize, to break enemy morale before the first arrow flew. The Persian commanders could see the Roman lines, pathetically thin, backed against their own city walls like animals in a trap, protected only by some amateur ditches that cavalry could clear with a simple jump. The Persians had crushed armies twice this size. They had broken Roman formations so many times it had become routine. This would be over by noon, and by sunset, Dara itself would be Persian property. They had absolutely no idea that they were about to become history's most famous tactical victims. At 6 a.m., the Persian formations were complete. Perazes had arranged his force with mathematical precision. 10,000 immortals formed the center, a solid block of elite cavalry that would smash through whatever resistance the Romans offered. On both wings, 20,000 light cavalry spread out in crescents designed to envelop and destroy. The remaining 20,000 formed a reserve, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough developed first. The formation was textbook perfect, the same arrangement that had won 17 battles against Roman forces. Every Persian commander could read the outcome in the dispositions. This was a 2-to-1 numerical advantage deployed with tactical excellence against an amateur general who had forgotten the first rule of warfare: never fight with your back to a wall. The psychological warfare began immediately. Persian war horns blared in sequences that Roman soldiers recognized from previous defeats. The drums beat in patterns specifically designed to accelerate heart rates and trigger fear responses. Research from captured Roman medical texts had taught the Persians how to weaponize sound itself. Then came the display of banners. 17 battle standards were raised, each one representing a major Persian victory over Roman forces. The message was unmistakable. You've lost before, you'll lose again, and this time nobody's coming to save you. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. At 6:30 a.m., Belisarius walked the Roman lines and spoke to his soldiers with a calmness that bordered on eerie. He pointed to the trenches and explained, in simple terms, exactly what would happen. They will charge through those gaps because they'll think they're weaknesses. When they compress, you kill them. The ditches aren't there to stop them. They're there to make them predictable. Some soldiers understood. Most just gripped their weapons tighter and prayed to whatever god still listened to desperate men. The Roman formation looked suicidal to trained military eyes. 25,000 men arranged in 5 discrete blocks, separated by those ridiculous trenches, with no continuous line that could support itself. Standard doctrine said you maintained a solid front. This looked like Belisarius had deliberately created gaps for the enemy to exploit. Persian officers pointed at the Roman dispositions and laughed. General Barismanes turned to Perazes and said, "He's made our job easier. We'll split his force into isolated groups and destroy them piecemeal." At 7 a.m., something shifted in the air itself. The wind died. The dust settled. Both armies stood in that terrible silence that precedes violence, where every man contemplates mortality and finds it wanting. Persian cavalry began walking their horses forward, a slow advance designed to build momentum gradually. The immortals checked their bowstrings one final time. The Savaran heavy cavalry lowered their lances. 50,000 warriors prepared to crash into 25,000 defenders and write another chapter in Persia's long history of dominance. Belisarius stood at the center of his lines, watching the Persian advance through eyes that had spent 6 weeks memorizing every inch of this battlefield. He had done everything possible to prepare. The trenches were perfect. The positions were optimal. His soldiers knew their roles. Now came the moment when theory would collide with reality and prove whether genius could multiply force or whether numbers would simply overwhelm innovation. At 7:15 a.m., the Persian light cavalry broke into a trot, and the greatest tactical upset in ancient military history began with the thunder of 20,000 hooves racing toward ditches that would soon run red with imperial blood. The Persian generals conferred, and their conclusion was unanimous. The trenches were annoying, but not decisive. The solution was simple: commit the immortals. 10,000 elite heavy cavalry, the finest warriors Persia had ever produced, would simply overwhelm these amateur defenses through sheer weight and skill. At noon, the immortals charged. The ground shook with 40,000 hooves, armor gleamed in the summer sun, and every Roman soldier felt his stomach drop because they knew what was coming. The immortals had never failed, never. had never even been seriously challenged. But Belisarius had planned for this moment. As the elite Persian cavalry compressed through the trench gaps, exactly as he designed, Roman infantry hidden in the center trench rose as one and unleashed a javelin storm at ranges where armor didn't matter. Horses went down in heaps, riders crashed into the ditches at full gallop, and the unstoppable immortals discovered that momentum becomes a liability when someone builds the right trap. For the first time in living memory, the immortals broke. They didn't just retreat, they fled in disorder, leaving nearly 1,000 of their best dead in ditches that shouldn't have mattered. Here's what made this moment genuinely insane. The immortals charged in a formation 40 ranks deep. Standard Persian doctrine for breaking infantry lines through sheer mass. But the trenches compressed that 40-rank depth into a funnel barely 30 yards wide. Think about the mathematics. 10,000 cavalry compressed into a space designed for maybe 2,000. The warriors at the front couldn't turn, couldn't evade, couldn't do anything except crash forward into Roman steel because their own comrades were pressed behind them. Belisarius had turned Persian strength into a death sentence. At 12:07 p.m., the first rank of immortals hit the killing zone. Roman infantry stationed in the gaps between trenches unleashed javelins at 15-yard range, close enough that a child could have hit the target. 4,000 javelins launched simultaneously into a compressed mass of cavalry that had nowhere to go. The front rank simply ceased to exist. Horses went down screaming, riders pitched forward with javelins through their lamellar armor, and the second rank crashed into the wreckage at full gallop. The physics were merciless. At charging speed, a horse can't stop in less than 20 yards. The immortals had perhaps 5 yards between recognizing the disaster and becoming part of it. The javelins kept coming. Roman infantry had been drilled for 3 days on one specific action. Throw, reload, throw again. No fancy maneuvers, no tactical complexity. Just mechanical repetition at ranges where missing was impossible. The third rank of immortals tried to wheel away from the killing zone, but the trenches prevented lateral movement. Warriors who tried to jump the ditches found themselves isolated, surrounded, pulled from their mounts by Roman infantry, who had been promised double pay for every elite Persian they killed. The lamellar armor that made immortals nearly invulnerable in open combat became a liability in close quarters. Heavy, restrictive, impossible to fight in when dragged to the ground. By 12:15 p.m., the charge had become a rout. 8,000 immortals were fleeing back toward their own lines, abandoning nearly 2,000 dead or dying comrades in and around trenches that every Persian commander had dismissed as amateur mistakes. The elite of the elite, warriors who had broken armies from India to Egypt, were running from a force half their numbers. The psychological damage was catastrophic. Persian cavalry that hadn't even engaged yet could see the immortals fleeing, could see the ditches choked with dead horses and dying warriors, could see that the invincible had been made very, very vincible. Perazes watched his best units disintegrate and felt the first cold touch of something Persia hadn't experienced in generations. Doubt. If the immortals couldn't break these lines, what could? He was about to find out that Belisarius had saved his worst surprises for last, and the battle's defining moment was still 30 minutes away. Here's what the Persian commanders had missed. Those center trenches weren't just defensive positions, they were hiding Belisarius's secret weapon. 600 Hunnish cavalry, the most mobile horse archers in the world, had been concealed in the deepest trench where Persian scouts couldn't see them. As the immortals reeled back in disorder, Belisarius gave the signal. The Hunnish cavalry erupted from the trenches and slammed into the Persian right flank at full gallop, hitting them from an angle that should have been impossible because no cavalry could have gotten into position there without being seen. The psychological impact was devastating. The Persians had thought they knew where every Roman soldier was. Suddenly, enemy cavalry was attacking from positions that their scouts had verified were empty an hour before. The Persian right wing, already shaken by the immortal defeat, simply collapsed. Thousands of warriors who had been winning moments before were now running, and the panic spread like fire through dry grass. Think about what Belisarius had accomplished. For 3 days, while Persian scouts mapped every Roman position from elevated ridges 2 miles away, 600 Hunnish horsemen had remained completely invisible. They'd stayed in that 7-foot deep centered trench, dismounted, keeping their horses calm with grain and water, carried in by infantry pretending to reinforce positions. Persian intelligence reports had noted the trench, but classified it as a reserve infantry position. Too deep for cavalry, too narrow for effective horse maneuvers. Every assumption was logical. Every assumption was wrong. At 12:42 p.m., Belisarius raised a red banner, the prearranged signal. The Hunnish commander, a veteran named Sunicus, who had fought in a dozen campaigns, gave the order his men had been waiting for since dawn. 600 warriors mounted in absolute silence, formed into 3 columns of 200 each, and waited for the second signal. The Huns weren't regular Roman cavalry. They were federati mercenaries from the Central Asian steppes, horse archers who could shoot backwards at full gallop and hit targets at 100 yards. They carried composite bows that could fire 20 arrows per minute, and they'd been chosen specifically because they were smaller, lighter cavalry that could maneuver in spaces where Roman cataphracts couldn't operate. At 12:45 p.m., the second banner rose. The Hunnish cavalry exploded from the trenches like a spring trap releasing. The Persian right wing was already in disorder, pulling back from the failed immortal charge, when 600 horse archers appeared from terrain they'd been certain was secure. The shock was total. Persian light cavalry on the right flank wheeled to meet this new threat, and found themselves facing warriors who could shoot, turn, and shoot again before Persian arrows even reached their targets. The Huns didn't charge into contact. They circled at 60-yard range, firing constantly, creating a mobile killing zone that the Persians couldn't close with and couldn't escape from. Here's where the tactical genius becomes clear. The Hunnish cavalry wasn't trying to destroy the Persian right wing. They were driving it backward, compressing it toward the center where Persian forces were already tangled in the aftermath of the immortal defeat. At 12:50 p.m., 8,000 Persian cavalry on the right were being pushed into 5,000 retreating immortals in the center. The cohesion that made Persian tactics work, the coordinated charges, the disciplined formations, dissolved into a confused mass where nobody could tell friend from enemy, where officers' commands were lost in the chaos of 20,000 warriors trying to occupy space meant for 10,000. The numbers defied military logic. 600 cavalry had routed 8,000, not through superior combat power, through psychological warfare and terrain manipulation. The Persians could see they outnumbered the Huns 10-1, but they were scattered, disorganized, and being driven into killing zones by an enemy that appeared and disappeared like demons. Every time Persian commanders tried to organize a countercharge, the Huns would fade back, circle, and hit from a different angle. It was guerrilla warfare at the tactical level, and the Persians had no counter for it. By 1 p.m., the entire Persian right wing had abandoned the field, fleeing north toward their original assembly areas. The Hunnish cavalry, having achieved their objective, pulled back to Roman lines with casualties so light they were almost negligible. 17 wounded, 3 dead. They'd eliminated a third of the Persian force from the battle without ever engaging in serious melee combat. But Belisarius wasn't done. While Perazes frantically tried to reorganize his remaining forces, the young Roman general was preparing to spring his final trap, and this one would break the Persian army completely. Between 1 p.m. and 1:17 p.m., the entire character of the battle changed. The Persian left wing, seeing their right collapse, tried to flank Belisarius's position by going wide around the northern trench. They rode directly into the second trap. Belisarius had positioned his Gothic cavalry, heavy shock troops who fought with long lances and sheer momentum, in a concealed position behind a slight ridge. As the Persian left wing charged past, attempting to envelop the Roman position, the Gothic cavalry smashed into their exposed flank with coordinated precision. The impact shattered the Persian formation like glass. Horse collided with horse at full gallop. Lances punched through scale armor, and suddenly the Persian flanking maneuver had become a massacre. The survivors tried to retreat, but found themselves compressed between the trenches they dismissed and the Gothic cavalry that was methodically butchering anyone who didn't run fast enough. 17 minutes after the Persian left wing began its charge, it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Gothic cavalry numbered 1,200 warriors, Germanic foederati who fought in the Roman service but maintained their own tribal fighting styles. These weren't the mobile horse archers that the Huns deployed. These were shock cavalry who charged in tight wedge formations with 12-foot lances designed to punch through armor at full momentum. Each warrior weighed over 200 pounds without armor. With their chainmail, helmets, and weapons, they carried 300 pounds on horses bred specifically for impact rather than speed. They were living battering rams, and Belisarius had hidden them behind a ridge barely 4 feet high that Persian scouts had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. Here's what made this trap so devastating. The Persian left wing, roughly 10,000 light cavalry, had committed to a wide flanking maneuver at 1:03 p.m., moving north to get around the Roman trenches and hit Belisarius's position from the side. Standard Persian tactics. Logical, sound, exactly what any competent commander would attempt when the center had stalled. But the maneuver required the Persian cavalry to extend their line, to spread out in a thin crescent that would wrap around the Roman flank. At 1:08 p.m., they were stretched over nearly 300 yards of frontage, moving at a fast trot, completely focused on the Roman infantry positions they were about to envelope. At 1:10 p.m., the Gothic cavalry commander, a tribal chief named Asbad, who had fought for Rome for 15 years, gave the order to charge. 1,200 heavy cavalry exploded over that slight ridge at full gallop, hitting the extended Persian line at a perfect 90-degree angle. Think about the physics. The Goths were charging downhill with 300 pounds per horse concentrated into a lance point. The Persians were moving laterally, exposed, unable to turn quickly enough to meet the threat. The first impact killed over 300 Persians in seconds. Lances punched clean through warriors and continued into the men behind them. Horses went down in tangles of broken legs and screaming chaos. The Persian left wing tried to wheel, tried to form a line to meet this unexpected assault. But cavalry can't pivot instantly at speed. The Gothic charge carved through their formation like an axe through soft wood. At 1:13 p.m., the Persian line simply broke. Warriors who moments before had been executing a textbook flanking maneuver were now fleeing for their lives, abandoning wounded comrades, throwing away weapons to lighten their horses. The Goths pursued with mechanical brutality, riding down stragglers, using their longer lances to spear fleeing warriors in the back. By 1:17 p.m., the butcher's bill was catastrophic. Nearly 2,000 Persian cavalry lay dead or dying on the northern approach. Another 3,000 had fled the battlefield entirely, abandoning the fight. The remaining 5,000 were scattered, demoralized, and combat ineffective. The Persian left wing had been functionally annihilated in 17 minutes of violence that turned a numerical advantage into a rout. Perazes sat on his horse and watched his army disintegrate. His right wing gone. His left wing destroyed. His center still reeling from the immortal defeat. In 2 hours of fighting, he'd lost over a third of his force without inflicting meaningful casualties on the Romans. The mathematics of victory had inverted completely, and now he faced a decision that would echo through Persian military history. Continue fighting and risk total annihilation, or preserve what remained and accept the unthinkable. Defeat at the hands of an outnumbered Roman force commanded by a general nobody had even heard of 6 months ago. By 2 p.m., the Persian numerical advantage had evaporated. They still had more soldiers on the field, but they were scattered, demoralized, and trapped in terrain that turned their cavalry superiority into a fatal disadvantage. Belisarius's trenches had done exactly what he designed them to do. They'd forced a 50,000-man army to attack through killing zones where numbers didn't matter, where the only thing that mattered was who controlled the angles and who had planned for this exact scenario. The Persian commanders tried to rally their forces, tried to organize another assault. But their soldiers had seen the immortals flee, had watched their best cavalry get slaughtered in ditches, and had no stomach for charging back into those kill zones. The trenches had become psychological weapons, and every Persian warrior could see the corpses of their comrades piled in those deceptively simple ditches. The mathematics of warfare had been inverted. 50,000 had become a liability because there was no room to deploy them, and 25,000 had become an advantage because Belisarius had built a battlefield where every Roman soldier could kill 2 Persians before the numbers even mattered. Let that sink in. Perazes had arrived that morning with 50,000 warriors. By 2:15 p.m., he had perhaps 32,000 still combat effective, 5,000 dead, 8,000 wounded or scattered. 5,000 more had simply abandoned the field, riding north toward Nisibis without orders, without formation, without anything except the desperate need to be anywhere except that valley of death. The Persian army had lost over a third of its strength in 7 hours, and Roman casualties stood at barely 1,200. Think about that exchange ratio. For every Roman who fell, 4 Persians died. This wasn't battle. This was systematic slaughter dressed in the language of tactics. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. At 2:20 p.m., General Barismanes attempted to organize one final assault. He gathered the remaining cohesive Persian units, roughly 15,000 cavalry who hadn't broken, and proposed a coordinated charge directly at the Roman center. No flanking, no clever maneuvers. Just mass and momentum against the weakest point in Belisarius's lines. It was desperation masquerading as tactics. But it was the only option left. The Persian officers knew it. The soldiers knew it. But what choice remained? Retreat meant admitting defeat to an inferior force. Continuing the fight at least preserved the possibility of redemption. Belisarius watched the Persian regrouping from his command post and made a calculation that separated good generals from great ones. His infantry was exhausted from 7 hours of combat. His Gothic cavalry had expended their momentum in the devastating flank. Charge. The Hunnish horse archers were running low on arrows. If the Persians committed everything to one massive push, they might actually break through. The odds were still against them, But desperation makes men dangerous, and Perazes still commanded enough warriors to cause catastrophic damage if they fought with nothing left to lose. So Belisarius did something that military academies would study for centuries. He ordered his entire line to advance 50 yards. Not charge, advance. A slow, measured, synchronized push forward that forced the Persians to either meet him or retreat. The psychological impact was devastating. The Romans, outnumbered and supposedly on the defensive, were advancing. It violated every principle the Persians understood about defensive warfare. Armies that had been winning didn't advance. They held position and made the enemy come to them. This looked like madness or supreme confidence, and both interpretations terrified the remaining Persian warriors. At 2:35 p.m., the Persian morale finally shattered completely. It started with a single unit on the far left, 200 cavalry who simply turned and rode away. Then another unit followed. Then another. Within minutes, Barismanis's carefully assembled final assault force was disintegrating without Roman soldiers even reaching them. The advance had accomplished what another hour of fighting couldn't. It had broken the Persian will to continue. The numbers defied historical precedent. An army twice the size of its opponent, composed of elite troops, commanded by veteran generals with 17 victories between them, was fleeing from a battlefield where they still held numerical superiority. This wasn't retreat. This wasn't tactical withdrawal. This was absolute psychological collapse, the kind that destroys military reputations and ends careers. Perazes sat on his horse and watched his army dissolve. In 17 major battles against Roman forces, he had never experienced this, had never even conceived that it was possible. And in that moment, he understood that he hadn't been defeated by superior numbers or better equipment or divine intervention. He'd been defeated by a 25-year-old general who had rewritten the rules of warfare while Perazes was still playing by the old ones. What happened in the next 30 minutes would transform military defeat into historical catastrophe and turn Belisarius from an unknown officer into a legend that would terrify Persian commanders for generations. At 3 p.m., the Persian army broke completely. It started with the baggage train guards, support troops who decided survival was worth more than honor. Then the outer cavalry units began pulling back without orders. Within minutes, the controlled retreat became a rout. 50,000 Persian warriors abandoned the field, abandoning their wounded, abandoning their supplies, abandoning every shred of the reputation for invincibility that had made Rome pay tribute for generations. Belisarius could have ordered a pursuit, could have turned the retreat into a massacre. But he held his cavalry back. Not from mercy, from calculation. His army was exhausted, his cavalry was spent, and chasing a broken enemy into unknown terrain was how you turned victory into disaster. Instead, he let them run. Let them carry the story of this defeat back to every corner of the Persian Empire. Let the psychological damage spread like poison through Persian military confidence. The speed of the collapse was unprecedented. At 3:05 p.m., 30,000 Persian cavalry were still technically organized, maintaining formation as they withdrew. By 3:15 p.m., that number had dropped to 15,000. By 3:30 p.m., the entire Persian force had dissolved into scattered groups of warriors racing north toward Nisibis, each group convinced that Roman cavalry was right behind them. The panic was so complete that Persian officers who tried to rally their men were simply ignored. In some cases, actually ridden down by their own troops desperate to escape. Here's what made the rout historically catastrophic. The Persians abandoned everything that couldn't move faster than a galloping horse. supply wagons containing 3 weeks of provisions, grain, dried meat, wine, left intact on the battlefield. Medical supplies worth a fortune in gold. Over 2,000 horses, too wounded to ride. 600 prisoners of war the Persians had been transporting. And most damaging of all, 17 battle standards representing 17 previous Persian victories. Those standards weren't just fabric and wood. They were symbols of Persian martial supremacy, blessed by Zoroastrian priests, carried into battle to intimidate enemies. Leaving them behind was spiritual defeat on top of military catastrophe. Think about what Belisarius was watching. His veteran officers were screaming at him to pursue, to finish the destruction, to turn this victory into a massacre that would end Persian military power for a generation. General Hermogenes, who had doubted Belisarius 6 weeks ago, was now begging for permission to chase the fleeing Persians with the Gothic cavalry. The opportunity was obvious. Broken enemies running in disorder were the easiest kills in warfare. A pursuit could have pushed Persian casualties from 5,000 dead to 20,000. But Belisarius understood something his officers didn't. His Gothic cavalry had been fighting for 7 hours. Their horses were blown, exhausted to the point where a sustained pursuit would kill them. The Hunnish horse archers had expended most of their arrows. His infantry was so tired that some men were literally falling asleep standing up. Adrenaline finally wearing off to reveal bone-deep exhaustion. If he pursued and the Persians rallied, if they found their courage again and turned to fight, his cavalry would be isolated, unsupported, and vulnerable. Victory could become disaster in minutes. More importantly, Belisarius understood psychological warfare. Every Persian warrior fleeing north would tell the story of this defeat, would describe trenches that swallowed elite cavalry, hidden forces that appeared from nowhere, and a Roman general who had systematically dismantled the most powerful army in the world. That story was worth more than killing another 10,000 Persians. That story would make future Persian commanders hesitant, cautious, afraid. Fear was a weapon that kept killing long after the battle ended. At 3:45 p.m., Belisarius gave the order that defined his strategic genius. Let them run. They'll do more damage to Persian morale alive than dead. His officers obeyed, though some clearly thought he was throwing away the chance to end the war in a single afternoon. What none of them understood yet was that this battle hadn't just saved Dara. It had saved the Eastern Roman Empire and announced the arrival of a military mind that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The butcher's bill was about to reveal just how complete the impossible victory had been. When the sun set on Dara, the accountants began their grim work. 5,000 Persian dead lay in and around those simple trenches. 3,000 more wounded had been abandoned in the retreat. The cream of the Persian military, the immortals, the Savaran, the heavy cavalry that had terrorized Rome for decades, had been functionally destroyed as fighting units. Roman casualties? 800 dead, 1,200 wounded. Think about those numbers. In a battle where the Romans were outnumbered 2-1, they had inflicted losses at a 6-1 ratio. This wasn't just a victory. It was a mathematical impossibility made real through tactical genius. The veteran officers who had doubted Belisarius, who had whispered that he was too young and too untested, stood silent among the dead and understood they had witnessed the birth of a military legend. The breakdown of Persian casualties told a story of systematic destruction. Of the 10,000 immortals who had charged at noon, nearly 2,000 lay dead. Another 1,500 were wounded so severely they'd been left behind. The elite of the elite had suffered 25% casualties in a single engagement. losses that would take years to replace, because immortals weren't just trained warriors. They were selected from birth and refined through decades of preparation. The Savaran heavy cavalry had lost 1,200 dead, 800 wounded. The light cavalry that formed the Persian wings had been functionally annihilated, 3,000 dead, scattered across 6 miles of retreat routes where exhausted horses had collapsed and riders had been left to walk home in shame. Here's what made these numbers genuinely catastrophic. Compare them to other major battles of the era. At Callinicum in 502, the Persians had defeated a Roman force with losses of roughly 15% on both sides. At Amida in 503, Persian casualties had been under 10% in a decisive victory. But at Dara, the Persians had lost 16% of their entire force killed outright, with another 6% wounded so badly they couldn't fight for months. Think about what that meant for Persian military planning. They'd committed their best troops, their most experienced commanders, their finest equipment, and lost nearly a quarter of the force in 7 hours. The Roman casualties, by contrast, told a story of defensive perfection. 800 dead out of 25,000, 3% losses. Most had fallen during the initial Persian archery barrage and the immortal charge, before Belisarius's traps had fully engaged. The 1,200 wounded were mostly minor injuries, arrow wounds in limbs, sword cuts that would heal in weeks. Only 200 Romans had been injured seriously enough to be discharged from service. The Gothic cavalry, which had delivered the devastating flank charge, had lost just 43 men. The Hunnish horse archers, who'd routed 8,000 Persians, had suffered 17 wounded and 3 dead. The mathematics defied every principle of ancient warfare. Defenders in open battle weren't supposed to have lower casualty rates than attackers who retreated. But here's where it gets insane. The captured Persian supplies were worth more than the annual military budget of 3 Roman provinces. Belisarius's quartermasters inventoried 600 tons of grain, 400 barrels of wine, 3,000 sets of scale armor abandoned by fleeing cavalry, 1,200 composite bows, each worth more than a Roman soldier's annual pay, and 270 war horses valuable enough to be reserved for Persian nobility. The 17 captured battle standards alone were priceless. They'd be paraded through Constantinople's streets, physical proof that the invincible Persians could be beaten. The wounded Persians left behind told stories that would haunt Persian military confidence for decades. Roman physicians, following the rules of civilized warfare, treated Persian wounded alongside their own. These men would return to Persia weeks later, with eyewitness accounts of trenches that channeled cavalry into killing zones, of Roman generals who fought like chess masters, of tactical innovations that made Persian numerical superiority meaningless. Every healed wound would become a story, and every story would spread doubt through the ranks of future Persian armies. General Hermogenes, who had openly questioned Belisarius's appointment, knelt before his commander at sunset and said 7 words that would be recorded in every military chronicle of the age. Quote 10, "But the true consequences of Dara were only beginning to unfold. This single battle would reshape the strategic balance of power across the entire eastern frontier and prove that Rome's long decline could be reversed by a single brilliant mind." The immediate strategic consequences rolled across the eastern frontier like thunder. Dara would not fall. The Persian advance, which had seemed unstoppable, ground to a complete halt. Tribute payments that Rome had made for decades simply stopped, because suddenly Constantinople had a weapon that Persia feared more than they wanted: gold. Young officers across the Roman military began studying Belisarius's tactics, and the concepts he'd pioneered at Dara, defensive positioning, concealed reserves, using terrain as a multiplier, became standard doctrine. The Persian military, meanwhile, spent years trying to understand how they'd been beaten so completely. Their answer was ultimately unsatisfying. Belisarius had built a new kind of warfare, and they'd walked into it blind. The balance of power in the east had shifted not because of resources or numbers, but because one 25-year-old general had dared to think differently about what a battlefield could be. Within a week of the battle, the news reached Constantinople. Emperor Justinian, who had gambled everything on an unknown officer, received confirmation that his empire had been saved by trenches and tactical genius. His response was immediate and unprecedented. He promoted Belisarius to Magister Militum per Orientem, supreme commander of all Eastern forces, and awarded him a triumph that hadn't been granted to a Roman general in over 50 years. More importantly, he canceled the tribute payments scheduled for August, 17,000 pounds of gold that would now stay in Roman treasuries. Think about that. One battle had saved Rome's economy from a bleeding wound that had drained wealth for 2 generations. The Persian response was chaos, disguised as strategic reassessment. King Kavad recalled Perazes to Ctesiphon, not for execution. Persian kings weren't that wasteful, but for intensive debriefing. Persian military academies spent months analyzing what had happened at Dara, dissecting the battle, trying to understand how their doctrines had failed so catastrophically. Their conclusions, preserved in Sassanid military manuals discovered centuries later, were brutally honest. Quote 11. Persian commanders began avoiding narrow valleys, refusing to engage Roman forces that had time to prepare defensive positions, and developing new tactics specifically designed to counter Belisarius-style warfare. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The psychological impact on Persian military morale was devastating and permanent. Before Dara, Persian cavalry charged Roman lines with absolute confidence. After Dara, they hesitated. Officers who had never questioned orders began asking reconnaissance teams to verify terrain features 3 times. The swagger that had made Persian armies terrifying became caution that made them predictable. Roman forces across the eastern frontier noticed the change immediately. Persian raids that would have been conducted by 2,000 cavalry in 529 were now requiring 5,000 cavalry in 531, because Persian commanders no longer trusted their numerical advantages. The tactical innovations spread faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, Roman commanders across 3 provinces were digging defensive trenches before major engagements. Within a year, the Imperial War College in Constantinople had added, quote, 12 to its curriculum, using Dara as the primary case study. Young officers who hadn't even been present at the battle could recite the trench dimensions, the timing of the Hunnish cavalry reveal, the angle of the Gothic charge. Belisarius had created not just a victory, but a replicable system, and that was far more dangerous to Persia than losing a single battle. The tribute payments, that annual humiliation that had drained Roman gold for decades, never resumed. Not because Justinian refused to pay, but because Persia stopped demanding. The implicit message was clear. The cost of extracting tribute from an empire that could produce generals like Belisarius was higher than the tribute itself. The eastern frontier, which had been bleeding Roman resources and territory for a generation, stabilized. Fortresses that had been preparing for evacuation began receiving reinforcements. Cities that had been negotiating surrender terms with Persian envoys sent those envoys home empty-handed. But perhaps the most important consequence was this. Belisarius had proven that Rome's decline wasn't inevitable, that tactical innovation could compensate for numerical weakness, and that one brilliant mind could change the course of history. The empire that had been writing its own obituary in 529 was now planning reconquests in 531. And at the center of those plans was a general who had turned ditches into weapons and mathematics into murder. Belisarius would go on to reconquer North Africa, invade Italy, and become arguably the greatest military mind of the ancient world. But Dara remained his masterpiece. The battle where everything he believed about warfare proved true against impossible odds. Military academies would study his trench system for centuries. Medieval commanders would copy his tactics of defensive positioning and concealed reserves. The Ottoman Turks would use variations of his defensive techniques to devastating effect. Modern military doctrine still teaches the principles he demonstrated. That terrain properly used can multiply force, that psychological warfare matters as much as physical warfare, and that numerical advantage means nothing if you fight the battle on your terms rather than theirs. In a single afternoon, outside a fortress city most people had never heard of, a 25-year-old nobody had saved an empire and proven that genius doesn't care about age, experience, or what everybody else thinks is impossible. The numbers tell the story of what came after. In 533, just 3 years after Dara, Belisarius led 15,000 soldiers across the Mediterranean and destroyed the Vandal kingdom, a Germanic empire that had controlled North Africa for a century. The campaign took 3 months. He captured the Vandal king, reclaimed Carthage, and added an entire province back to Roman control. In 535, he invaded Italy with just 7,500 troops and began dismantling the Ostrogothic kingdom, a campaign that would take years but would restore Roman control over the Italian peninsula. Think about that trajectory. From unknown staff officer to the man who reconquered half the Western Roman Empire in less than a decade. Dara had been the announcement. North Africa and Italy were the proof. Here's what made Dara's tactical legacy so profound. The defensive trench system Belisarius pioneered didn't just win one battle, it became fundamental military doctrine. Byzantine armies used variations of his tactics for the next 400 years. The Strategikon, the Byzantine military manual written 50 years after Dara, devoted 3 entire chapters to defensive field works that were direct descendants of Belisarius's innovations. Medieval European commanders, many of whom had never even heard Belisarius's name, were using tactics he'd invented. The English longbowmen at Crécy in 1346 used stakes and trenches to channel French cavalry into killing zones. Pure Dara, 800 years later. The Ottoman Turks, who would eventually conquer Constantinople in 1453, studied Byzantine military manuals and adopted Belisarius's defensive techniques. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, Ottoman forces used earthworks and positioned troops to create psychological traps that forced European cavalry into predetermined kill zones. The battlefield engineering that won Dara had evolved, but the core principles remained unchanged. Control the terrain, channel the enemy, make their strengths into weaknesses. Modern military doctrine explicitly references Dara in strategic planning courses. The U.S. Army War College teaches Belisarius's battle as a case study in quote, _14, Special Forces training includes modules on how small units can defeat larger forces using defensive positioning and psychological warfare. Direct intellectual descendants of trenches dug in 530. Israeli Defense Forces tactical manuals cite Dara when teaching commanders how to leverage terrain advantages. 2,500 years later, Generals are still learning from a battle fought with horses and spears. But here's what makes Belisarius' story truly extraordinary. He wasn't born into military greatness. He didn't come from a famous family. He hadn't spent decades earning his reputation. He was 25 years old with 0 major victories, commanding soldiers who thought he was a political appointee, facing an enemy that had forgotten what defeat felt like. And in 7 hours, he dismantled every assumption about what was possible. The lesson of Dara isn't just about tactics or terrain. It's about the power of thinking differently when everyone else is trapped in orthodoxy. It's about questioning every assumption, especially the ones that quote 1-5 are true. It's about understanding that the way warfare has always been fought isn't necessarily the way it must be fought. Belisarius looked at the same battlefield every other general would have seen and asked a question nobody else thought to ask. What if the ground itself could fight? That question saved an empire, revolutionized warfare, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't superior numbers or better equipment. It's a mind that refuses to accept that impossible means impossible.